Hi. If you turn over to 1 Samuel 18, it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, 1 Samuel. I personally can never get enough of that stupid joke. David's first wife, Michal, M-I-C-H-A-L. By the way, the title of the message for the college students is Who is Michal? So you got to keep notes. Who is Michal? She has been a mystery to me because she's really a minor character in the Bible, but she has an outsized influence. And for the most part, she has a pretty negative reputation, primarily because of one event. When David was bringing the ark back to Jerusalem, she despised him and told him so. And because of that, she ended up not being able to have children for the rest of her life. And that has caused, a lot of people to look down on her, with good reason. That's not what she did. It wasn't necessarily a good thing. But the problem is that there's very little about her other than these 4 incidents we're going to look at tonight. And consequently, when I was doing some research on it, I discovered there's dozens of different interpretations of her life, all the way from, I read a feminist interpretation that said that she was a victim of the patriarchy, the usual nonsense. But then another one that said that she was a pagan troublemaker that was seeking to destroy David's kingdom, which didn't make any sense either because she didn't seem that bad. So I decided to take it. I've had an interesting last few days because I was trying to find a way into this, how to look at this and how to view her. And I think I found something. We're going to take a look at this from what the King James has to say about her. But beginning in verse 12 of chapter 18, we read this. And Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him and was departed from Saul. Therefore Saul removed him from him and made him his captain over 1,000, and he went out and came in before the people. And David behaved himself wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. Wherefore, when Saul saw that he behaved himself very wisely, he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he went out and came in before them. So, Saul has lost the blessing of God because of his disobedience, and the Lord sent Samuel to anoint David to be the next king, and David is now beginning to see, and Saul is beginning to see the Lord working in his life to bless David, to raise him up. And he's becoming more and more influential in the kingdom. He is the rising star of the nation. Basically, David is starting to replace Saul, at least in the hearts of the people of Israel. Now, that leads Saul to come up with a plan. Beginning in verse 17, we read this. And Saul said to David, Behold, my elder daughter Merab, her will I give thee to wife. Only be thou valiant for me, and fight the Lord's battles. For Saul said, Let not mine hand be upon him, but let the hand of the Philistines be upon him. And David said unto Saul, Who am I? And what is my life for my father's family in Israel, that I should be a son-in-law to the king? But it came to pass at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, that she was given instead unto Adriel, the Mahalathite, to wife. So what's going on here? Saul privately, I believe, went to David and said, Look, if you continue doing what you're doing, I'll let you marry my daughter Merab. And David was nonplussed. He was humbled by the offer. He said, How can I be a king's son-in-law? Notice, though, that Saul did not put a deadline when he said, As long as you continue doing this, I'll give you my daughter. But he didn't say, I will, as long as you behave wisely for the next year, I'll give you my daughter. He didn't put a time limit on it, which means basically he didn't really want David to marry his daughter. He wanted David to die. He was hoping that by continuing to do what he was doing, he'd end up dying in battle and he wouldn't have to worry about him anymore. But as it turns out, it didn't work that way. So in verse 20, we read this. And Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David. And they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. And Saul said, I will give him her, that she may be a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Wherefore Saul said to David, Thou shalt this day be my son-in-law in one of the twain. So, privately, Saul decided that he was going to give his love-struck second daughter, Michal, to David. but she would be a snare to him. Now, for the longest time I read that and I thought, she must have a really bad character. She's going to be a snare. But he's not saying that she is the one that's going to be the snare. Rather, she's the bait. He's putting her out as bait to get David to fall by the Philistines. And David, well, in verse 22, we read this. And Saul commanded his servants, saying, commune with David secretly and say, behold, the king hath delight in thee, and all his servants love thee. Now, therefore, be the king's son-in-law. And Saul's servants spake those words in the ears of David. And David said, seemeth it to you a light thing to be a king's son-in-law, seeing that I am a poor man and lightly esteemed? And the servants of Saul told him, saying, on this manner spake David. And Saul said, thus shall ye say to David, the king desireth not any dowry, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines to be avenged of the king's enemies. But Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. So Saul is he found out what was keeping David from wanting to do this, why he was humbled. Because David was poor. He's a shepherd, and he doesn't have a whole lot of money. You have to pay a dowry to buy a wife in ancient Israel. He's basically buying Michal. And he couldn't do it. He just knew he didn't have the kind of money to pay for a king's daughter. But Saul said, don't worry about it. All you got to do is kill 100 Philistines. You do that, and I'll give you Michal. He was convinced there's no way this guy's going to be able to kill 100 Philistines. Well, it turns out David's response was interesting. And where am I at here? There, verse 26. And when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law. And the days were not expired. He had a time limit to do this. But notice, he said it pleased him to be the king's son-in-law. It doesn't say that it pleased him to marry Michal. The interesting thing about this is not that he wouldn't love Michal and take care of Michal, but the big thing for him was that he was going to be the king's son-in-law. What does that mean? Well, simply this. To be the king's son-in-law would mean that he was legally part of the royal household. He would now be a son to the king. But even more so, by marrying into Saul's family, he was providing future security for his household. If you know anything about history, particularly European history of the last 500 or 600 years, but other places in the world, when two kingdoms were fighting with each other, the easiest way for them to stop fighting and have a peace accord was to marry their children. Okay? And this is an ancient thing going all the way back to this time. So David knew that if he married into the king's house, once he became king, Saul's house would less likely be there to try to overthrow him. Now, it didn't quite work out the way he was expecting, but the fact remains that was the hope. By being the king's son-in-law, he would also be part of the house of Saul. And so when the house of David took over the throne, the house of Saul would not be a danger to him. So it was a political move. Now, some of the commentaries I read said this is political. He's taking advantage of the situation. It's self-aggrandizing for him to be doing this. I don't think so. He knew from the time he was around 17 that he was going to be king because that's when he got anointed. And he was not a stupid man. He saw the Lord raising him up slowly, getting into the household as David's harpist, and then becoming Saul's armor bearer, and eventually in the army and succeeding in the army. He saw, yes, I'm going to be king. The people are starting to see me and trust my judgment. So he's thinking ahead. When I'm king, I've got to make sure I've got a stable kingdom to rule the people. So this is just looking ahead to marry her. And so he's pleased by this. And he goes out and he kills 200 Philistines. Now, he already saw Saul give Merab to somebody else. So he figured, I better make sure I've got 100. He's not going to say, oh, you only got 99, David, I can't give you her. So you got 200. There's no way you can miscount 200, okay? And that leads us to verses 28 and 29. And Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. Excuse me. And Saul was yet the more afraid of David, and Saul became David's enemy continually. Then the princes of the Philistines went forth. That is, they went out to battle against David. And it came to pass after they went forth that David behaved himself more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so that he was much set by. Not only did the princes came out, he fought them, is what the idea here is. And by doing so, he gained even more reputation with the people of Israel. Saul was seeing everything he planned against David just fall apart. And now David is in his household. So, Saul did the only logical thing you do when you're a crazy old king. He decided he was going to murder David himself. Chapter 19, verse 1, we come to the second story here. This is a short time later. David, by the way, was about 21 or 22 when that event took place. He was a relatively young man. So this is just a short time later, maybe within a year or so. Chapter 19, we read this in verse 1. And Saul spake to Jonathan, his son, and to all his servants, that they should kill David. Now, Jonathan is David's best friend. Saul, though, is saying, Jonathan, I want you to kill your best friend. He didn't say it quite that way, of course. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David, and Jonathan told David, saying, Saul, my father, seeketh to kill thee. Now, therefore, I pray thee, take heed to thyself until the morning, and abide in a secret place, and hide thyself, and I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where thou art, and I will commune with my father of thee, and what I see, that I will tell thee. And he reconciles David with Saul for a short time. But it didn't last long, because down in verse 9 we read this. And the evil spirit from David is back, he'd gone out to battle, and he comes back and he's playing the harp before Saul. And the evil spirit from the Lord was upon Saul as he sat in his house with the javelin in his hand. And David played with his hand. And Saul sought to smite David even to the wall with the javelin. Now he'd done this a couple of times before. And David escaped, but he came back. He kept because he was part of the house. But now we see something else happen. And David fled and escaped that night. At this point, David decides, I got to get out of here. This guy is getting way too dangerous. He probably drew that conclusion from what Jonathan had just told him, that his father wanted to have him killed. So he's thinking, okay, my life isn't worth a whole lot before Saul. But that leads to verse 11. Saul also sent messengers unto David's house to watch him and to slay him in the morning. So he's facing the possibility that he's going to be assassinated the very next morning by some people that Saul has sent out to them. The second half of verse 11 says this. Michal, David's wife, told him, saying, If thou save not thy life tonight, tomorrow thou shalt be slain. She knew what was going on. She was not stupid either. And so she came up with a plan. Beginning in verse 12, we read this. So Michal let David down through a window, and he went and fled and escaped. So she got him out of there at night through a window, and he ran off. But then verse 13, we read this. And Michal took an image and laid it in the bed and put a pillow of goat's hair for his bolster and covered it with a cloth. And when Saul sent messengers to take David, she said, He's sick. And Saul sent the messengers again to see David, saying, Bring him up to me in the bed, that I may slay him. And when the messengers were come in, behold, there was an image in the bed with a pillow of goat's hair for his bolster. So basically what she did was buy time. She got him out at night, and now she's keeping the assassins at bay by telling them that he's sick, they can't get him. And when they find out, they, of course, are furious. And they go and tell Saul, and Saul says this. Saul said unto Michal, Why hast thou deceived me so, and sent away mine enemy, that he has escaped? Saul is speaking to David's wife, and she doesn't say, Why did you send your husband away? He said, Why did you send my enemy away? What Saul is doing when he says this is shifting her thinking from helping her husband to helping her father's enemy. She answers this. And Michal answered Saul, He said unto me, Let me go. Why should I kill thee? Now that has been one of those negative things too, that people say, well, obviously she's a real turncoat because she didn't stay faithful. But based upon what we already saw, that she was important to David for securing his kingdom in the future, do you think he didn't tell her that? that she didn't know that? She's a king's daughter. She is his only link to the house of Saul. If she dies, he's got nothing. This is his one hope, to be able to get the kingdom consolidated once Saul is dead and he's king. So, the one question that comes up over and over, I saw in the commentaries, is why didn't she leave with David? It was a good thing that she did. She saved his life and she bought him some time. But she put David in a poor light to Saul, and she ended up marrying a second husband. Go over to chapter 25 just for a moment. I hope everybody's following this. That's my big concern, because this can get a little complicated. Verse 40. And when the servants of David were come to Abigail to Carmel, they spake unto her, saying, David sent us unto thee to take thee to him to wife. And she arose and bowed herself on her face to the earth and said, Behold, let thine handmaid be a servant to wash the feet of the servants of my Lord. And Abigail hasted and arose and rode upon an ass with 5 damsels of hers that went with her. And she went after the messengers of David and became his wife. David also took Ahinoam of Jezreel, and they were also both of them his wives. David is on the run from Saul, but he still managed to marry 2 women. But Saul had given Michal, his daughter, David's wife, to Phalti, the son of Laish, which is of Galem. So now she's effectively committing adultery. But why didn't she go with David? Well, here's why. She probably didn't go with him because David wanted her to preserve that link that he had with the house of Saul. If she'd gone with David, she would be as much of an enemy to Saul as he was. But by saying, Daddy, he wanted to kill me, suddenly her dad is going to protect her. The only place you could be protected at this time in Saul's kingdom was by proving yourself to be a friend to Saul. Because if you weren't actively trying to be on Saul's side, you were going to be his enemy. We see later that Saul was not above killing his own children. He didn't actually succeed in doing this, but he threatened to kill Jonathan when Jonathan was helping David later in chapter 20. So it's entirely within the realm of possibility that he would have killed Michal if she said anything about supporting her husband at this point. So she went along, became Saul's daughter again, and he, like a good father of this time, married her off to another guy. So she'd be safe and protected and under another male authority, another husband. By making it look like David had turned on her, Michal was able to gain Saul's protection until David became king. And consequently, she would be available to come back and be with David as his queen once Saul was gone. And that's exactly what happens in the next section. Turn over to chapter 3 of 2 Samuel. So much political intrigue. Oof. 2 Samuel chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. David's on the throne, Saul's dead, but we read this. Now there was long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. And David waxed stronger and stronger, and the house of Saul waxed weaker and weaker. And then jump down to verse 6. And it came to pass, while there was war between the house of Saul and the house of David, that Abner made himself strong for the house of Saul. Now you might be saying, well, didn't you just talk about how the house of Saul and the house of David were united because of Michal? Michal is not with David at this point. In fact, the house of Saul is convinced that David and Michal are no longer an item. In other words, in their mind, David has no more connection to the house of Saul. We can fight David because he doesn't belong. He shouldn't be the king. Our family should be the king. Okay? So they're fighting to have Ishbosheth, the last remaining son of David, of Saul rather, alive to become the king. And Abner, the general of Saul's army, who is also one of Saul's relatives, is back behind Ishbosheth trying to get him in there. But jump down, if you would, to verse 7. And Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah. And Ishbosheth said to Abner, wherefore hast thou gone into my father's concubine? Now understand, if that had happened, Abner would have been attempting himself to become the king. Then was Abner very wroth for the words of Ishbosheth, and said, am I a dog's head, which against Judah do show kindness this day unto the house of Saul thy father, to his brethren and to his friends, and have not delivered thee into the hand of David? And that thou charged me today with a fault concerning this woman? So do God to Abner, and more also, except as the Lord has sworn to David, even so I do to him, to translate the kingdom from the house of Saul, and to set up the throne of David over Israel and over Judah, from Dan even to Beersheba. And he, that is Ishbosheth, could not answer Abner a word again, because he feared him. Ishbosheth had deeply offended Abner. Abner was the only hope he had for becoming king, and now he's saying, no, I'm going to overthrow the house of Saul myself and put the house of David in charge. And in verse 12, we see Abner's plan put into action. Pardon me, I have to look at my notes real quick here. By the way, we're on page 2. Page 2, guys? Yeah. It's a big deal to the college students. Page 2. Thank you. I'm so lonely up here. Verse 12. And Abner sent messengers to David on his behalf, saying, whose is the land? Saying also, make thy league with me, and behold, my hand shall be with thee to bring up all Israel unto thee. And David said this, well, I will make a league with thee, but one thing I require of thee, Abner, thou shalt not see my face, except thou first bring Michal, Saul's daughter, when thou comest to see my face. To Abner he said, you got to bring Saul's daughter to me. Why did he say that to Abner? Because Abner is serving as kind of the de facto manager of the house of Saul. David's only connection to the house of Saul is Saul's daughter, Michal. And so he's telling the manager of Saul's house, bring me the one thing that makes me part of your house. Michal, Saul's daughter. And then he says this in verse 13, or verse 15 rather, or verse 13. Verse 13? No. Verse 14. I can't read. This is a coloring book. And David sent messengers to Ishbosheth, Saul's son, saying, deliver me my wife, Michal, which I espoused to me for 100 foreskins of the Philistines. What's he saying to Ishbosheth? He's saying, brother-in-law, send me the wife that makes me your brother-in-law. In other words, to Abner, he's saying, politically, this is how I'm going to be allied with your house. Send me Saul's daughter. To Ishbosheth, he's saying, make me part of the family again. Send me my wife that I bought from your dad, and we can be brothers again. David was not a fool. He knew what he was doing. And all of this was there so that he could build and secure his kingdom, that he was on the throne, so he could stop all this nonsense. Now, in verse 15, we read this. And Ishbosheth, I'm having a hard time pronouncing it. Ishbosheth sent and took her from her husband, even from Phaltiel, the son of Laish. So Ishbosheth made it a point to take her and get her back to David. And this happened. And her husband went with her along, weeping behind her to Baharim. It was a pretty good sign that they had a pretty good marriage for 10 years. This, by the way, is about 10 years or 12 years later, after David had escaped. Then said Abner unto him, go, return. And he returned. And that was the end of it. Now, what happened here? Well, quite simply, by doing this, David reestablished his link between the house of David and the house of Saul. So there should be security here, peace between the two houses, as one would expect. So David has everything secured now. Saul is out of the way. his wife is back, and everything is fine. The bluebirds are coming down and singing. Angels are playing their harps, and everything's wonderful. Until chapter 6. Beginning in verse 1 of chapter 6, we read this. This is just a few years later, after all of that. And again, David gathered together all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. And then down in verse 11, we read this. And the ark of the Lord continued in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite 3 months. And the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. Between verses 1 and 11, I won't take a long time on this, David wanted to bring the ark back to Jerusalem to be with him, because he knew the ark of God was both the presence of God among Israel, and it was also the blessing of God upon Israel. That wasn't wishful thinking or having a lucky charm. God had promised that he would dwell where the ark was. He is their God, and he wants to bless them. And David knows this, so he wants the ark near him where the capital is, because everything can be centralized there. Later on, his son, of course, builds a temple, and that's where they put the ark. And God dwells there until they no longer are obeying him properly, and he leaves. But David manages to bring the ark back. And beginning in verse 12, we read this. And it was told King David, saying, the Lord hath blessed the house of Obed-Edom, and all that pertaineth unto him, because of the ark of God. So David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom into the city of David with gladness. And it was so that when they had bare the ark of the Lord had gone 6 paces, they sacrificed oxen and fatlings. And David danced before the Lord with all his might. And David was girded with a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the trumpet. And down in verse 17, and they brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in his place in the midst of the tabernacle that David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And as soon as David had made an end of offering burnt offerings and peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts. And he dealt among all the people, even among the whole multitude of Israel, as well to the men, women as men, to every one a cake of bread and a good piece of flesh and a flagon of wine. I've always wanted to get a flagon. What's the size of a flagon? Anyway, so all the people departed, every one to his house. So David got the ark in, and he's having a party, and he's dancing with all his might before the ark as it's coming into the city. They plant it where it belongs, and the whole nation is here having this party because the ark has come back to where it belongs. But then, verse 16, and as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, Saul's daughter, looked through a window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord. And she despised him in her heart. Now, first of all, she's not at the celebration. We saw that the rest of the nation was there celebrating. Why is she sitting in a palace looking out a window? That's where some people have suggested that she was not really all that religious. Well, maybe, maybe not. We don't really know for sure. But she despised David in her heart when she saw the way he was acting. In verse 20, we see her response, her verbal response to David. Then David returned to bless his household, and Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, how glorious was the king of Israel today, who uncovered himself today in the eyes of the handmaids of his servants, as one of the vain fellows shamelessly uncovereth himself. David, you're out there dancing in a linen ephod, exposing yourself to the servants of the servants, the lowest of the low in society in Israel. You're dancing with them and you're carrying on. How glorious you looked, O king. Verse 21, though, David responds to this. And David said unto Michal, it was before the Lord, which chose me before thy father, and before all his house, to appoint me ruler over the people of the Lord, over Israel. Therefore will I play before the Lord, and I will yet be more vile than thus, and will be base in mine own sight, and of the maidservants which thou hast spoken of them shall I be had in honor. David said, God picked me to replace your dad. Ouch. I will do this, and I'll do even more in thanks to God for what he's done for us. And these servants that you're condemning will honor me, even though you won't. That's painful. But it's even more painful when we read verse 23. I lost verse 23. There it is. Therefore, Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child unto the day of her death. No children. Now, you read that in the Bible, and, there's other places where women don't have any children. Why is that such a big deal? I've never been a woman. Never have been. Don't plan on it. So I don't know what that desire is to have children. But I do know this about Israel. Israel had an interesting thing going on here. It was important to them because God had promised to Abraham that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars of the sky and the sand in the sea. They would also be a mighty nation that would come from him. Jump forward roughly 800 years after that promise, and you now have a mighty nation living in the land that was promised to Abraham, several million people living here. And in the minds of the people, particularly the women, every child they had was a blessing from God to fulfill the promise that he had made to Abraham. In other words, to have children was something they did to fulfill the promise that had been given to Abraham that they'd be a great nation. And to not have children would cause you to think, God's not blessing me. What have I done wrong? Well, in Michal's case, she knew perfectly well what she did wrong. She cursed David. But why is cursing David, or rather despising him and telling him this, such a cause to take away that blessing from her life? Well, simply this, just to review all of this political stuff I brought up here. She was instrumental in David's reign. She had united the houses. She was the key to David uniting the house of David and the house of Saul. Consequently, she was crucial in stabilizing the future of the kingdom. And God had promised David that he would be the future of the kingdom. First here that he was going to replace Saul, but then later on he promises that he'd have an eternal throne through the Messiah. Pretty big stuff. And she had just, despised his rule. Ultimately, that's what she did. What happened here? Well, in David's response, he's suggesting that she is putting the past ahead of the present. She's saying, my dad never would have acted like that. Who is she comparing him to when she said, you were so mighty, king, dancing like that, like a fool? She had to be comparing him to her own father because that's the only other king she knew. You're not like my dad was. Kind of a stupid thing to live in the past. But even more so, as a woman in Israel, she was under the authority of her father until she was married, and then she was under the authority of David. As soon as she was married, that should have been the primary authority in her life. Okay? But when she did this, took sides with Saul against David, she's going away from the authority she should be under and going back to the authority she had been under. And that authority she should be under was now the one that had been given God's blessing to rule his people. Okay? So effectively, she was saying, I don't really want God's plan here. I want the way it used to be. She was effectively standing against the will of the Lord for David and Israel by saying, I want Saul. Now, does that mean she wasn't saved? Not necessarily. But it does mean she had a real problem in here because she wasn't going along with God's plan for Israel. Now, what does that mean? Over in 1 Corinthians 10:11, if you jump over there, Michal's not mentioned in 1 Corinthians 10:11, by the way. But something else important is mentioned here. And you may already know what this verse says. But if not, we'll turn there. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 11. Paul having talked about the Israelites in the wilderness and their failure to obey the Lord there, he says this, "Now all these things happened unto them for examples, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come." The story of Michal was recorded in the Old Testament as an example to us of something. But an example of what? Well, first of all, Michal was letting her past as Saul's daughter influence her present as David's wife. We must not, as believers, let the past control our present. Jump over to Ecclesiastes 7. That's Matthew, Mark, Luke, Ecclesiastes. I can't remember where it is now. It's before Isaiah, okay. It's before Song of Solomon. Ecclesiastes 7, there we go. Verse 10. "Say not thou, what is the cause that the former days were better than these? For thou dost not inquire wisely concerning this." To live in the past and want the past back in place of the present is to be a fool. She was acting foolishly in doing this. But even more importantly, being under the authority of both Saul, her father, and David as her husband left Michal in a rather tense situation. She had to make a choice. And she really had to make a choice every day. I'm going to follow David. Regardless of what my father did, he's the man I now love, claim to love, and follow. I should do what he wants. Jesus said, we cannot serve two masters. Now, he said that in a different context, but it's a true statement. If you try to serve both masters, you're going to end up loving one and hating the other. In this particular point, he decided to love Saul and hate David. That's basically what despising is. She should not have done that. And that left her in a situation where she was chastised for it. She lost the opportunity to have children to be raised up to the nation of Israel. We should also realize that we have to serve the master that we have pledged ourselves to. If you're born again here tonight, you are under the authority of Jesus Christ, who died for you, and you've committed yourself to him by trusting him to save you from your sins. We should decide daily to live under his authority. Honestly, it's so easy to say, it was better back then. Or to want to go back. Your family's putting pressure on you. You know, your unsaved family is saying, why are you going to that church all the time? And it's easy to go back to that and kind of compromise. That's what's going on here. The authority you're under is Christ. What did Jesus say about your family once you're saved? He said you should hate your father and your mother, not literally hate them, but he should be more important than anything else in your life. That's the idea. But it's something that we have to do regularly. We have to be vigilant about this to be sure that we're keeping him as the authority in our lives. Are you doing that? Is this the time that maybe you should be looking to renew your commitment to Christ, the one who saved you? I hope so.